The doctrine of discovery, rooted in 15th century papal bulls, used Christian theology to justify European land seizures and enslavement by framing non-Christians as spiritually and legally inferior. Below, I break down the key parts that enabled colonizers to weaponize religion for these purposes, connecting to your focus on the manipulation of indigenous, melanated people's spiritualities. Key components of the doctrine that justified land theft and slavery. 1. Divine mandate to spread Christianity. Papal bulls like Dum Diversas, 1452, and Romanus Pontifex, 1455, by Pope Nicholas II, authorized Portugal to conquer non-Christian lands and peoples, explicitly tying colonization to the spread of Christianity. Inter Caetera, 1493, by Pope Alexander VI, extended this to the Americas, granting Spain and Portugal rights to lands not ruled by Christian kings. Religious justification. These bulls declared that converting heathens was a divine duty. Non-Christian lands were deemed terra nullius, empty or unclaimed in a Christian sense, ignoring indigenous spiritual and political systems. This allowed colonizers to claim land as God's will, dismissing the sacred connections indigenous peoples had to their territories. Impact. By framing conquest as a holy mission, the doctrine sanctified land theft, portraying indigenous resistance as defiance of God. 2. Dehumanization of non-Christians. Theological basis. The bulls labeled non-Christians as infidels or savages outside God's covenant, implying they lacked divine rights to their lands or freedom. Dum Diversas explicitly permitted the enslavement of non-Christians, arguing it served their salvation. Slavery justification. This theology cast indigenous and African peoples as spiritually deficient, justifying their enslavement as a means to civilize or Christianize them. For example, Romanus Pontifex endorsed Portugal's enslavement of West Africans, framing it as a Christian act. Impact. By stripping non-Christians of spiritual legitimacy, the doctrine enabled colonizers to enslave millions, particularly in Africa and the Americas, while claiming moral superiority. 3. Supremacy of Christian sovereignty. Legal framework. The doctrine established that only Christian rulers had legitimate sovereignty. Indigenous governance, rooted in spiritual traditions, African elder councils or Native American tribal systems, was dismissed as invalid because it wasn't Christian. Land seizure. This principle allowed European powers to claim lands by planting crosses or flags, as seen in Columbus's actions in 1492. The doctrine ignored indigenous land stewardship, which was often tied to spiritual practices like honoring earth spirits or ancestors. Impact. It created a legal religious pretext for dispossessing indigenous peoples, from the Taino in the Caribbean to the Khoisan in southern Africa. How religion was weaponized. Scriptural misuse. Colonizers selectively used Bible passages like Deuteronomy 28:43-44, your earlier reference, to suggest their dominance over indigenous peoples was God-ordained, implying non-Christians were cursed or destined to be ruled. This ignored the context of indigenous spiritualities, which were often communal and land-based, not incompatible with biblical values like stewardship or justice. Missionary complicity. Missionaries often accompanied colonizers, preaching that conversion was the path to salvation, while tacitly supporting land grabs and slavery. Indigenous spiritual practices, Yoruba Orisha worship or Lakota ceremonies, were demonized as idolatry, justifying their suppression. Moral cover for exploitation. By cloaking their actions in religious rhetoric, colonizers obscured the economic motives, gold, spices, slave labor, behind their conquests. The doctrine's theology provided a moral excuse for atrocities, creating the confusion you mentioned by distorting the spiritual realities of indigenous peoples. Specific examples. Africa, Romanus Pontifex, 1455, directly supported Portugal's slave trade in West Africa, claiming enslavement brought Africans to Christianity. This laid the groundwork for the transatlantic slave trade, which uprooted millions of spiritually rich African communities. Americas, Inter Caetera, 1493, justified Spain's conquest of Native American lands. The Requerimiento, 1513, a Spanish document read to indigenous peoples, demanded they accept Christianity and Spanish rule, or face enslavement and war, citing papal authority. Why it worked. The doctrine's religious framework succeeded because it aligned with Eurocentric Christianity's view of itself as the sole path to truth, dismissing indigenous spiritualities as inferior. This allowed colonizers to override the moral and spiritual agency of melanated peoples, creating a narrative where theft and slavery were framed as divine providence.
Moses answered the people, "Do not be afraid. Stand firm, and you will see the deliverance the Lord will bring you today. The Egyptians you see today, you will never see again."
Right, you be a good field hand, and you can stay here.
As you can see, the doctrine enabled these crafty counselors to present their actions as part of a God-ordained global order where European culture and Christianity were the pinnacle of civilization. So if you are interested in more deep dive content in history, share this short video for more updates.